It was a crisp autumn morning when I first heard the sharp, impatient knocks on my front door, the kind that told you the person on the other side believed they owned the world. I wasn't expecting visitors, but the urgency sent a ripple of unease down my spine. I wiped my hands on my work jeans, my boots still caked in dirt from tending the garden, and pulled the door open to a sight I instantly knew would bring trouble. A woman, dressed in a perfectly pressed cream blazer, her blonde bob so stiff it barely moved in the breeze, stood with a clipboard clutched in her manicured hands. Her lips pursed in the way only someone used to barking orders could manage. Behind her, a sleek white SUV was parked at the edge of my gravel driveway, its gleaming exterior a stark contrast to the rustic charm of my land. She exhaled sharply, eyes scanning my porch like she had just discovered a crime scene. Then she leveled her gaze at me, full of the entitled authority only people like her carried. "Good morning," she said, in the tone of someone who meant the exact opposite. "I'm Karen Williams, the chairwoman of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. We need to talk about the violations on your property." I blinked at her. Violations? My property wasn't part of the HOA. This house, this land, had belonged to my family for over a century, passed down through generations who had fought hard to keep it. 15 acres of sprawling farmland, a whitewashed fence lined with history, a barn that had seen more seasons than most of the newly built homes in the area. I knew every inch of it like the back of my hand, and I sure as hell knew it wasn't subject to the ridiculous suburban rules of an HOA. "I think you're mistaken," I said, keeping my voice level. "This property isn't part of Oak Ridge Estates." Karen's expression barely flickered. She pulled the clipboard up, flipping through pages. "Actually, it is," she said, tapping a sheet of paper like it held the authority of a court order. "Your land borders our development, and as such, it falls within our community's aesthetic guidelines. It's an issue of property values." She stressed the last words like she was explaining to a child why they couldn't eat dessert before dinner. I felt a sharp rise of irritation, but kept my face neutral. "That doesn't make sense. My house has been here for over 100 years. You can't just decide it's part of your HOA." Karen let out a practiced, condescending sigh. "It's not about what was here first. It's about maintaining the integrity of our neighborhood. Your property is visible to residents, and quite frankly, it's an eyesore." Her eyes flicked toward my barn, the vegetable garden in the front yard, the chicken coop off to the side. "We have standards in Oak Ridge Estates. The board has identified several areas that need to be brought up to compliance." She pulled out a printed list, reading off each item with an air of importance. "First, the vegetable garden has to go. Only ornamental landscaping is allowed in front-facing yards. Second, that chicken coop is unsightly and violates livestock restrictions. Third, this fence." She gestured at the weathered but well-maintained white picket fence that had stood for decades. "Needs to be replaced with our standard black aluminum fencing. And finally, your house needs a fresh coat of paint in one of our approved colors." She looked up with a tight-lipped smile, as if she had just done me a favor. "You'll have 30 days to comply." I stared at her, the audacity of her words sinking in like cold water. "No," I said simply. Karen's smile didn't waver, but I could see the muscles in her jaw tighten. "Excuse me?" "No," I repeated, firmer this time. "I don't have to comply with anything because, again, I'm not in your HOA." Her eyes narrowed. "You don't seem to understand. Your property is affecting the values of the homes in Oak Ridge Estates. If you refuse to cooperate, we'll have no choice but to escalate the matter." I crossed my arms, meeting her stare. "Go ahead. Take it to whatever imaginary authority you think you have. But I'm not taking down my garden. I'm not moving my chickens, and I'm sure as hell not repainting my house to match your bland suburban aesthetic." Her face turned a shade darker, the mask of polite dominance slipping just a fraction. She took a deep breath, then said in a voice dripping with forced patience, "Then I suppose you leave us no choice but to involve legal action. The HOA board will be conducting an official inspection next week, to document your violations. You will be expected to comply with the necessary corrections within the given time frame. I took a deliberate step forward, watching her instinctively shift back. "Let me be clear," I said, my voice like steel. "If you or anyone from your little committee sets foot on my property without my permission, it's called trespassing. And I'll make sure the sheriff is involved." Karen's expression twisted with fury. "You'll regret this," she snapped. I smiled. "We'll see." She stormed back to her SUV, jabbing at her phone as she stomped across the gravel. The engine roared to life, and a moment later, she sped off down the road, leaving a cloud of dust in her wake. I watched her go, already knowing this was just the beginning. HOA types didn't take no for an answer, but neither did I. Love seeing entitled people get what they deserve. Subscribe for more crazy stories like this. A week passed, and just as I expected, Karen wasn't the type to let things go. She was the kind of person who believed the world bent to her will, and when it didn't, she forced it to. The first sign of her escalation came in the form of a thick envelope shoved into my mailbox, stamped with an official-looking HOA letterhead. I opened it right there by the fence, skimming over the ridiculous demands written in stiff legalese. According to the letter, I was officially notified of my non-compliance with Oak Ridge Estates regulations and had 30 days to make necessary corrections. The violations were listed again in painstaking detail. The removal of my vegetable garden, the demolition of my chicken coop, the replacement of my outdated and unsightly fence, and the mandatory repainting of my home in one of their approved color schemes. At the bottom, in bold letters, was a warning. Failure to comply would result in escalating fines and potential legal action. The sheer absurdity of it almost made me laugh. They had no legal right to fine me, no jurisdiction over my property, and yet, here they were, sending threats as if they had any real power. I wasted no time driving into town to see my lawyer, Jim Thompson, an old family friend who had handled my grandmother's estate. He took one look at the letter and chuckled. "They really think they can force you into their HOA," he said, flipping through the pages. "This is nonsense. Your land is legally separate, and they have no authority here." He leaned back in his chair, tapping the papers against his desk. "But Karen doesn't seem like the type to back off easily." I nodded, already knowing that was true. "So what's our move?" I asked. Jim smirked. "We hit them back before they get too comfortable. I'll send a cease and desist letter today. Make it clear that they have no legal standing here. And while we're at it, I'll draft a notice making it crystal clear that any attempt to enter your property will be considered trespassing." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. I left his office feeling confident, but that confidence lasted only until I pulled into my driveway the next evening and found Karen and 3 of her HOA board members standing in my front yard, clipboards in hand. My stomach tightened with anger as I stepped out of my truck, my eyes immediately darting to the security cameras I had installed years ago. Good. If they were dumb enough to be here, I was going to have proof of every second of it. Karen turned at the sound of my boots crunching against the gravel, her expression smug, as if she had already won. "We are conducting an official HOA inspection," she announced, gesturing to her clipboard like it was some sort of badge of authority. "Your property has numerous unresolved violations, and we're documenting them." My fists clenched at my sides. "You are trespassing," I said evenly. "I didn't give you permission to be here." One of the board members, a wiry man in a polo shirt who looked like he took his role far too seriously, sniffed and flipped a page on his clipboard. "Your property affects the entire community," he said as if that justified their presence. "We have every right to ensure compliance." I took a step forward, staring Karen down. "You have no right at all. You see those cameras?" I pointed to the one mounted above my porch, its red recording light blinking steadily. "They've been recording since you set foot on my property. That means I have solid proof of you trespassing. Now, you can leave on your own, or I can call the sheriff and have you escorted off." Karen's face darkened, her smug confidence cracking for the first time. But instead of leaving, she doubled down. "You don't want to do that," she warned, her voice low. "This will only get worse for you." I let out a short laugh. "Oh, I absolutely want to do that." I pulled out my phone and started dialing. Karen's eyes widened slightly, but before I could hit call, she spun on her heel. "We're leaving," she snapped at the others. But this isn't over. The board members hesitated for a moment before reluctantly following her. As they climbed into their pristine SUVs, I made sure to record them driving off, capturing every license plate just in case. The moment they were gone, I sent the footage to Jim, who immediately forwarded it to the sheriff's office along with a formal trespassing complaint. If Karen wanted to play legal games, she was about to find out she was up against someone who wasn't afraid to fight back. But the harassment didn't stop there. The next morning, I woke up to find a new letter taped to my front door. This one threatening legal action if I didn't comply within 2 weeks. The wording was more aggressive this time, almost desperate. It was clear Karen was trying to scare me into submission, but all she was doing was digging herself deeper. I ignored the letter and went about my day, but by that evening, I had another visitor. This time, a county code enforcement officer. He was a middle-aged man with tired eyes, clearly used to dealing with HOA nonsense. "Got a complaint about unauthorized livestock," he said, nodding toward the chicken coop. "And unapproved structures." I sighed. "Let me guess. HOA complaint." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Yep, got a call from a Karen Williams." He said the name with barely concealed irritation. "Figured I'd come check, but honestly, I don't see any issues here." I gestured toward the paperwork I had pulled in preparation for exactly this. "All legal. I have the agricultural zoning permits, and the coop is within code." The officer barely skimmed the documents before nodding. "Yeah, this is a waste of my time. Sorry about that. Some HOAs think they run the world." He turned to leave, then paused. "You want me to note this as a frivolous complaint? Might help if this goes to court." I grinned. "That would be perfect." As he drove off, I realized exactly what was happening. Karen wasn't just trying to intimidate me. She was trying to bury me in paperwork, hoping I'd get tired of fighting and give in. But what she didn't know was that I was just getting started. If she wanted a battle, I was ready for war. The following week, things escalated in a way that was both ridiculous and infuriating. Karen had decided that legal threats and harassment weren't enough. Now, she was going to get even more aggressive. It started with another letter, this time claiming that if I did not comply within 10 days, the HOA would take further action to enforce community standards. It was laughable, considering they had zero legal authority over my property, but it told me one thing. Karen was getting desperate. That desperation turned into something far worse when I came home one evening to find that my fence had been vandalized. The same historic white fence that had stood for over 100 years was now covered in bright red spray paint, words scrawled across it in sloppy, angry letters. "Property values matter. Clean it up." My stomach twisted with fury as I scanned the area, my hands clenched into fists. This wasn't some random act of vandalism. No, this had Karen written all over it. I pulled out my phone and checked my security footage, scrubbing through the recordings until I found exactly what I was looking for. There, clear as day, was Karen herself, sneaking onto my property in the middle of the night with a can of spray paint. And she wasn't alone. One of her HOA cronies, a lanky man with glasses and a clipboard tucked under his arm, stood watch while she defaced my fence like some delinquent teenager. They were so confident, so sure that they were untouchable, that they hadn't even bothered to hide their faces. My pulse pounded as I watched the footage, my anger only growing stronger with each passing second. I didn't waste a moment. I sent the footage straight to my lawyer, Jim, who wasted no time forwarding it to the sheriff's department. Within the hour, Deputy Matthews, who was already well aware of the HOA's antics, was at my front door, reviewing the footage with a slow shake of his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered. She really thought she could get away with this. I exhaled sharply. Not just thought, she assumed. She thinks she owns everything around her. He nodded, setting his jaw. Well, she's about to find out otherwise. With that, he took the footage and filed an official report for vandalism and trespassing. But even as he assured me that Karen was about to face serious legal trouble, I knew in my gut that this wasn't over. People like her didn't back down, they doubled down. And sure enough, just 2 nights later, I caught her again. This time, she had a different plan. I was woken up around 2 a.m. by the sound of rustling near the chicken coop. Groggy but immediately alert, I reached for my phone, opening the security app to check the live footage. And there she was, Karen, in her ridiculous designer pajamas, crouching near the coop, struggling with the latch as if she were trying to break it open. For a split second, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Was she really trying to release my chickens? As if on cue, one of the birds let out a startled cluck and Karen flinched, looking around wildly before yanking at the latch again. That was enough for me. I grabbed my shotgun, not loaded, just enough to make my presence clear, and stepped outside onto the porch. The moment I flipped on the floodlights, Karen froze, caught like a raccoon in the garbage. What the hell do you think you're doing? My voice was calm, steady, but filled with the kind of authority that made people listen. Karen gasped and stumbled back, nearly tripping over her own feet. I was just... She straightened, trying to regain her composure, but it was too late. I was investigating a complaint. Your chickens are a nuisance, and I cut her off with a sharp laugh. You were breaking into my coop in the middle of the night. You're trespassing again, and this time, I have it all on camera. Her face paled. She looked toward the street, as if considering making a run for it. But I shook my head. I already called the sheriff. That did it. The last shred of her bravado crumbled, and she turned on her heel, making a beeline for her car. But before she could escape, Deputy Matthews pulled up, lights flashing as he stepped out of his vehicle, arms crossed. Going somewhere, Karen, he said, his voice laced with amusement. Her entire body went rigid. This is harassment, she shrieked. I was trying to enforce community standards. Deputy Matthews let out a slow whistle. By breaking into a chicken coop at 2 a.m, he shook his head. You're under arrest for trespassing and attempted theft of livestock. Karen's mouth fell open. You can't do this. I'm the HOA chair, and this man isn't in your HOA, Matthews reminded her as he cuffed her. You had no reason to be here. But hey, don't worry. I'm sure your lawyer will love explaining why you were trying to steal chickens in your pajamas. I stood there watching as she was led to the squad car, still spluttering protests. But it was over. This was the moment she had lost. And just to drive the point home, I turned on the camera and recorded as they drove away, capturing every second of her downfall. Within hours, the video was making rounds on the neighborhood Facebook group, and by morning, the entire community was buzzing. The HOA board, desperate to distance themselves from her, held an emergency meeting and voted to remove her as chair. But the best part? The very development she had fought so hard to protect from my unsightly property was now the subject of a public scandal. Home values were dropping not because of my farm, but because of the unhinged woman who had tried to control it. It was poetic justice. And as I stood on my porch that morning, sipping coffee while my chickens clucked happily in their still secure coop, I knew Karen's reign of terror was finally over. The fallout from Karen's arrest was nothing short of spectacular. The very same people who once followed her blindly in the HOA were now scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. It wasn't just the Facebook groups and neighborhood gossip. No, this had gone beyond that. The local news station had picked up the story, and within 24 hours, Karen Williams' mugshot was plastered on every screen in town. The headline was brutally honest. HOA chairwoman arrested for trespassing and vandalism in bizarre attempt to enforce rules. The best part? My security footage was part of the broadcast. They showed her sneaking onto my property, vandalizing my fence, trying to break into my chicken coop, like some deranged lunatic. The footage of her being cuffed and stuffed into the squad car was a cherry on top. The comments under the online article were ruthless. People who had once considered her a pillar of the community were now calling her an embarrassment, a bully, and an entitled control freak who got exactly what she deserved. The HOA board, desperate to salvage what little credibility they had left, sent out an official statement condemning her actions and voting to remove her from her position immediately. They even tried to claim they had no idea what she had been doing, as if that somehow excused the years of harassment they had backed her on. That wasn't enough for me. Jim, my lawyer, was already on top of things. The cease and desist letters hadn't worked. The legal warnings hadn't worked. But now that she had been caught red-handed, there was no escaping the consequences. Jim filed a civil lawsuit against her for trespassing, property damage, and harassment. And because I had video evidence of everything, there was no wiggle room for her to deny any of it. She had to pay for the repairs to my fence, which, thanks to its historical status, wasn't cheap. The damages alone were over $15,000, and that was before the court slapped her with additional fines. And because the sheriff's office had officially charged her with trespassing and attempted theft of livestock, she was looking at an actual criminal record. Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of neighborhood prestige, now had a mugshot floating around, a court record, and thousands of dollars in damages to pay. I thought that would be the end of it, but the universe had one last twist of poetic justice in store. You see, while Karen had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood under the guise of protecting property values, her own house was in direct violation of several HOA rules. That was something I hadn't even considered. But once she was removed as chair, people started talking. It turned out that Karen had an illegal extension built on her property, one that had never been approved by the HOA's own guidelines. Not only that, but she had been renting out part of her house on the side, violating the community's strict zoning regulations. With her gone, the remaining board members, eager to prove that they were nothing like her, turned on her instantly. They hit her with fines, violations, and a court-ordered deadline to tear down the illegal extension. Suddenly, the very rules she had wielded like a weapon were coming back to destroy her. Within weeks, her house had a foreclosure notice slapped on the door. She had poured everything into her power-hungry reign over the HOA, and now she was drowning in legal fees, fines, and a crumbling reputation. And then, just like that, she was gone. One day, a moving truck showed up in front of her house. She packed up what little she could salvage and disappeared. Some say she left town entirely, retreating to some far-off place where people didn't know her name. Others say she tried to join another HOA in a different community, but word had already spread, and no one wanted her in charge again. Either way, she was out of my life for good, and the best part, my property, the one she had tried so hard to control, was now more valuable than ever. Thanks to the HOA scandal and the news coverage, more people had become aware of my farm and its history. I started getting requests from local schools and gardening groups who wanted to visit, to learn about the heirloom crops I grew, to see the rescue animals I had saved. People from Oak Ridge Estates, the very community Karen had been trying to protect from me, started stopping by to buy fresh eggs, vegetables, and even handmade goods. The irony was almost too good to be true. Karen had fought so hard to erase my property from existence, and in doing so, she had made it more important than ever. The new HOA board, realizing they had no fight left, sent me a formal apology letter. They assured me that they would respect my property rights and that there would be no further interference from their organization. As a token of goodwill, they even invited me to their next community barbecue, hoping to extend an olive branch. I didn't bother attending, but I did send over a basket of fresh produce, eggs, and homemade jam with a note attached. No hard feelings, I had written, but let's keep things neighborly from now on. Things finally settled down after that. The legal battles were over. The harassment had ended, and for the first time in months, I was able to enjoy my home without the shadow of an overreaching HOA looming over me. My chickens clucked contentedly in their coop. My horses grazed lazily in the pasture, and my garden flourished under the golden afternoon sun. The farm was still here, still standing strong, just like it always had. My great-grandparents had built this place with their own hands. My family had kept it alive through generations, and now I had defended it from the biggest threat it had ever faced. Not time, not nature, but one entitled woman who thought she could control what wasn't hers. And so, life went on. The security cameras stayed in place, just in case another HOA tyrant ever got any ideas. The town eventually moved on to new gossip, new dramas, and new scandals, but I knew that somewhere, people would always remember Karen Williams, the woman who lost everything because she couldn't mind her own business. And every now and then, when I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the land my family had fought so hard to keep, I'd think about her and smile. Because at the end of the day, I had won, not just a legal battle, not just the property rights, but the right to live my life on my terms, free from the ridiculous rules of an HOA that had never owned me in the first place. And that, more than anything, was the sweetest victory of all.